Good evening and welcome to Understanding the Iowa Gun Amendment, a faith-based perspective. I'm Sister Nancy Miller, Social Justice Coordinator for the Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary and the Sisters of St. Francis of Dubuque. On November 8th, Iowans will have the opportunity to vote on an amendment to the state constitution that could lead to the elimination of reasonable gun safety measures. Tonight, we will hear from three speakers who will provide an explanation of what this amendment is, while it is both morally disconcerting and dangerous. Our panelists this evening are Art Roche, Acting Chair of the Iowans for Gun Safety, Tom Chapman, Executive Director of the Iowa Catholic Conference, and Dr. Tom Brzezinski, Ph.D. in Public Policy and Political Science from Florida State University. Tonight's presentation is brought to you by Women Religious Congregations of Iowa and others. They are the Sisters of St. Francis from Clinton, Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Sisters of St. Francis Dubuque, Des Casal Carmelite Nuns, the Congregation of the Humility of Mary, Sisters of the Presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Sisters of Mercy of the Americas Justice Team, Dominican Sisters of Sinsinawa, and Divine Word College. The Leadership Conference of Women Religious, or LCWR, is the Association of the Leaders of Congregations of Catholic Women Religious in the United States. In 2013, the following statement was released. We, the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, are compelled to work toward a world where reverence for all living beings finds expression in an approach to life free from violence. We stand in solidarity with the victims of violence, with the majority of the American people, and with the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, as we heed the gospel call to nonviolence and seek to persuade our local, state, and federal officials to enact laws that will require universal background checks for all gun purchases, restrict civilian access to assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, make gun trafficking a federal offense, improve access to mental health care and other services for those in need, fund programs that make available educational material on the effects of violence, and provide opportunities for youth and young adults to end gang violence. At this time, I would like to introduce Sister Marilyn Hugridge of the Sisters of St. Francis of Clinton, who will lead us in an opening prayer.
Thank you, Nancy. Source of justice, rock of strength and truth, you call upon us to stand in the name of common sense and reason, to witness on behalf of the innocent and the cut down, the widowed, orphan, and the bereaved, to answer the scourge of senseless loss, to advocate for reasonable gun safety measures, to remove military weapons from a civilian population, to return sanity to our laws, our policies, and our lives. Bless those who dedicate themselves to gun safety. Grant them fortitude and perseverance. May the work of their hands never fail, nor despair deter them from their holy calling. Blessed are you, God of all being, who summons us to choose life. First, choose life. Above all, choose life.
Thank you, Sister Marilyn. It is my great pleasure now to introduce our three panelists. Art Roche is a retired healthcare executive. He is actively engaged in monitoring gun-related legislation and advocating for common sense gun laws. He is acting chair of Iowans for Gun Safety. He's a committee member of Dubuque Coalition for Nonviolence and serves on the Communications Committee of Iowans for Responsible Gun Laws, the organization formed specifically to oppose the Reckless Gun Amendment, known as Public Measure 1. Tom Chapman. Tom has served as Executive Director of the Iowa Catholic Conference since 2007. The Iowa Catholic Conference is the public policy voice of the Catholic bishops of Iowa and represents bishops at the state capitol. Chapman is a member of the Board of Directors for the Iowa Alliance for Choice in Education. He has also served on the boards of the Des Moines Area Religious Council, Iowa Religious Media Services, the National Association of State Catholic Conference Directors, Iowa Mediation Services, and Shelter House. Chapman was raised in Spirit Lake and is a graduate of Briar Cliff University. He began his career as a news reporter for KMEG TV before working in communications at Mercy Medical Center in Sioux City. He was chancellor for the Diocese of Des Moines from 2002 to 2007 and director of communications for the diocese from 1990 to 2002. Tom and his wife Paulette have 3 adult children and worship at Holy Trinity Parish in Des Moines. Our next panelist is Dr. Tom Brzezinski. He is a seasoned college professor with 3 teaching awards and has served in various leadership capacities at the university level. He holds a Ph.D. in political science and public policy from Florida State University and a BA in pre-law studies from Penn State. Dr. Brezenski was most recently an associate professor of political science for 19 years at St. Thomas University in Florida, where he taught courses in global politics and history, law, American politics and history, and political theory and history and policy. Following the massacre at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida in 2018, he was appointed by Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz to a congressional district gun violence task force, along with Fred Gutenberg and the mother of the late Trayvon Martin. Dr. Brezenski has published multiple peer-reviewed scholarly journals, articles on the topic of gun violence, and is recognized as an expert in the field. His article on the tragic Parkland school shootings is arguably one of the most widely read in the field on the incident. We are so grateful that each of you could join us this evening and provide your expertise in understanding this public measure proposed amendment that will appear on the Iowa November ballot. And for our audience, if during tonight's presentation, if you have questions for our speaker, at the conclusion of the presentations, you will be able to type your questions to me, Nancy Miller, in the chat box. And at that time, we will attempt to respond to questions as time permits. So at this time, we welcome Art Roche, who will begin his presentation. Art, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Nancy. I need to add one thing to my resume. I didn't realize at the time I agreed to do this that Divine Word College was one of the sponsoring organizations for this event, and I'm a happy and proud alumnus of Divine Word College. So on November 8th, 2022, Iowans will be asked to vote on an amendment to the Iowa Constitution dealing with guns. How did this amendment get on the ballot? Well, first it needed to be passed by both houses of Iowa legislature, the House and the Senate, in 2 consecutive 2-year sessions. So that's a period of 4 years. This happened in the 2019-2020 session and in the 21-22 sessions. So with the exception of one person's vote one time, all legislators voted along party lines in both of those sessions. And it, of course, was passed both times. It was signed by Governor Kim Reynolds and set for the public vote in November 2022, coming right up. Here's the proposed amendment. This is the language that Iowans will be voting on. At first glance, it looks a lot like the U.S. Second Amendment. Take a little time to read it, and especially read that last sentence, that third sentence. Any and all restrictions to this right shall be subject to strict scrutiny. Okay, now if you're a voter reading this for the first time, And like most Iowa voters, you are fed up with gun violence, and you see the words strict scrutiny, you might think, yeah, that sounds pretty good. We need to get stricter about guns. But as Tom Brzezinski will tell you in his presentation, that's exactly the opposite of what strict scrutiny means. The important thing for Iowa voters to remember is that the proposed reckless gun amendment is not just a restatement of the federal Second Amendment, but a broad overreach that we think will have disastrous consequences. Here are the two amendments side by side. On the left is the wording from the US Second Amendment. On the right is the proposed Iowa amendment. Take a few minutes to compare and contrast. I'll let you read them. They are similar, but the strict scrutiny language in the proposed Iowa amendment changes everything. That's why you won't hear us calling this Iowa's Second Amendment. Proponents of the amendment will tell us that Iowa is one of 6 states that don't have a gun amendment in their constitution. And they're sort of correct. So this is an interesting map. 41 states in the dark blue have an amendment that echoes the US Second Amendment, virtually identical to the US Second Amendment. So it changes nothing in those states. It makes some people feel good, but it doesn't really accomplish any legal, doesn't have any legal basis. Amendments like the one proposed for Iowa have been adopted by only 3 other states, and those are shown in red: Louisiana, Alabama, and Missouri. Not good role models. These might be lovely states to visit. They might have individual and fabulous cuisines and fun tourist things, and you may have family living there. You might even be from those states. But as far as gun death rates, they are 3rd, 4th, and 5th. So not good role models for Iowa. So the 6 states in the light blue are the ones that don't have gun-related constitutional amendments yet. And they are California, Minnesota, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, and Iowa. So we stand with the majority of Iowa gun owners and dealers who are responsible and don't want to prohibit reasonable safety measures like universal background checks, gun safety training, requiring a license to carry a gun in public, all of which would be at risk if the reckless gun amendment is approved by voters. A majority of Iowans support banning the carrying of a firearm while under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Majority support prohibiting felons from possessing firearms. Majority supports requiring background checks on all gun purchases, including gun shows and private sales and ghost guns. The majority supports requiring gun safety courses before the purchase of a handgun. And these aren't just simple majorities. These are huge, overwhelming majorities of Iowans, 91% down to 72%, but still almost 3/4 or better in every case. If approved by voters, this reckless gun amendment, and that's our name for it, the reckless gun amendment, public measure 1, would put the right to carry a gun above the right to safety, above my right not to get shot. And it would lead to the invalidation of existing or future reasonable gun safety measures that keep Iowans safe. We view gun violence as a public health issue because we are focused on the number of people, young and old, dying and injured by guns. Take a look at these numbers. 1 American shot every 5 minutes. 1 American dies by gunfire every 14 minutes. 323 Americans are shot, and 104 of them die every day. These are averages from the last few years, but the numbers are probably higher right now than these. In 2020, guns surpassed vehicles as the #1 cause of deaths among children. That's a startling fact that most of you probably weren't aware of. But guns are the #1 killer of children in America right now. And that's been the case for the last 2 years. Black Americans they continue to be disproportionately impacted by gun violence, and women are another group that's especially vulnerable. Look at that number, 21 times more likely to be murdered with a gun than in any other high-income country. Bringing these statistics closer to home, because we were looking at national statistics. So these are Iowa numbers. Guns are involved in the deaths of approximately 302 of your fellow Iowans annually. Again, this is an average over the last few years. 302 people dying from guns. 78% of these are suicides. So that may be another surprising statistic for you, that many more people die of gun suicides than of gun homicides or even accidental gun deaths in Iowa. In general, we tend to react to mass shootings and school shootings. When those things happen, we certainly get upset. But we forget that the vast majority of shootings and shooting deaths do not fall into these categories. Most gun violence could be lessened with common sense gun regulations, which are threatened by this amendment if it is passed. And if it's passed by voters in November. Existing laws will be unenforceable. Future laws will be nullified. Proposed amendment values reverence for guns over reverence for life. Our concern isn't those people who are dedicated to passing what I think of as the opposition. It's really a tiny percentage of voters. And we're not encouraged at the same time by the small part of the electorate who have heard about this issue and will vote against it. Many of you, many of us. It's that middle part, the 75 to 80% of the voters in the middle who have no idea that this is on the ballot. They have no idea what it means and may easily decide to vote yes because strict sounds good if you're talking about guns. And it's just the Second Amendment. It's no change, is it? So if we are unsuccessful, this is how we will lose. So show your love for Iowa. Turn the ballot over and vote no. Thank you.
Thank you, Art. And now we welcome Tom Chapman as our next panelist and speaker.
Well, thank you very much and good evening, everybody. I really appreciate the invitation to be with you tonight. My purpose, I've been asked to cover the Catholic Church's perspective and the Catholic Bishops of Iowa's perspective on this public measure #1. You know, in addition to our legislative advocacy, one of the things we do is provide resources for Catholics and other people of goodwill based on 2 principles of Catholic social teaching: the dignity of the human person and the common good. Our opposition to this gun proposal should be seen in the context of these principles. Human life is sacred, and we should be addressing the threat to life posed by gun violence with the full strength of our tradition. The dignity of the human person means that every person is created in the image and likeness of God, and we are all equal in that way. We also work in support of the common good. These are the goods that we have in common and we basically all access in the same way. You know, we have a right to life, a right to clean food, clean water, shelter, productive work at fair wages, healthcare and education. These are about the necessities that we all need to thrive. One of our responsibilities through our charity and in society is to make sure that all people can access the common good. In fact, from our perspective, it is a primary role of government to help guarantee the common good. Now, gun violence itself is often an attack on human dignity. Our church teaches that people do have a right to self-defense and be able to protect themselves. But much of the gun violence that we see is not about that. It's an attack on the dignity of the human person. Remember, every person is created in the image and likeness of God. Pope Francis has also connected this issue to the care of creation, which, as many of you know, is a very top priority for him. The Pope has asked us, what is happening in the education of people who commit these mass shootings? What is happening in their way of life? What is happening in their personal history that makes these people go on attacking and destroying? I think that's something that we should reflect on. And in the meantime, be asking ourselves, do we really want to make it impossible to meaningfully address the gun issue in our state? Now, at the national level, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops wrote to Congress earlier this summer and asked them to confront a culture of violence. In this letter, they asked for several legislative items, as you can see here on the screen, including an extreme risk protection order law, and we believe that might be helpful to prevent suicides, a ban on assault weapons, a ban on bump stocks, limitations on access to ammunition magazines, also looking at perhaps a more appropriate minimum age for gun ownership, and universal background checks for all purchases. The bishops also strongly encourage that all manner of policies be crafted to cultivate a strong family life. We're not going to solve this issue only through gun safety or gun control laws. There are many deeper issues at play, and that's worthy of another presentation itself, but that's something that we really need to keep in mind. Now, here in the state of Iowa, the Iowa Catholic Conference has been working with several other groups over the years in opposition to the recent changes in gun laws. Here regarding weapons, one was Stand Your Ground in 2017, which removed any duty to retreat in the face of any perceived threat. And then in 2021, the legislature took away any requirement to have a permit to carry a weapon. We've also been working for several years, at least 5 or 6 years now, opposing this gun amendment that's going to be on the ballot. You can see a letter from the Catholic Bishops of Iowa on our website from 2018, which talks about these things. And also, I did want to mention, we really appreciate our collaboration with other religious groups, some of which include the United Methodist Church, the Episcopal Church, and many people from the UCC as well. So we appreciate working together on this issue. So coming up on November 8th, the Catholic Bishops of Iowa are advising a no vote on public measure number 1, saying that the right to bear arms as found in our Constitution must be balanced against the safety and well-being of the populace as a whole. I had a presentation at a church earlier this week, and this issue actually came up. There was a young woman there who shoots for sport. She's a gun owner, and she talked to the group about how she's questioning whether this amendment is even necessary. And I think she's on the right track. Passing this public measure number 1 would make it very difficult to put in place even modest policies that would affect the right to bear arms. In fact, that's why the proposal's on the ballot. So thank you for your participation tonight, and I'm happy to take questions later.
Well, thank you, Tom. Now we move on to the other Tom, Dr. Brzezinski.
Good evening. I would like to thank the multiple religious organizations that have graciously invited me here tonight. But before I begin, I would like to share a little bit more about myself. Not only am I a gun violence analyst, but I'm also a gun violence survivor. In May of 1983, I was working at a garage in a town on the outskirts of Newark, New Jersey. Back then, one of the worst cities in the country when it came to gun violence. One night, as I was about to put the money from my shift away in the safe, a man with blonde hair wearing a ski mask managed to sneak up on me and put the barrel of a .357 Magnum on the bridge of my nose and ordered me to hand over the money. I, of course, complied, and that is why I'm able to be here with you tonight. I left New Jersey the next year for college and never returned. Since then, my home state, through enacting common sense firearms legislation, is one of the safer places in the nation when it comes to gun violence. As both someone who has investigated tragic gun violence incidents, my own 17-year-old son lost a friend from swimming at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland in 2018, as well as almost becoming the victim of gun violence myself, I'm here tonight to state without hesitation that a no vote on Iowa's Public Measure 1, otherwise known as the Right to Bear Arms Amendment, is a public necessity to avoid 21st century Iowa from turning into a early 1980s New Jersey or having a Parkland occur in Dubuque. Next slide, please. It's been said many times over that statistics don't lie, and that is true when it comes to gun violence in states. According to the Centers for Disease Control, along with many other organizations that track gun violence, the most violent states with respect to firearms, as Art Roach mentioned, are the ones that have either constitutional amendments or statutes like Public Measure 1 on the books. On the other hand, states with the lowest levels of gun violence have for the most part stayed away from doing things like enacting Public Measure 1. Being a so-called Second Amendment state doesn't make you any safer. It, in effect, has the potential to do exactly the opposite. Next slide, please. The strict scrutiny test was invented by the Supreme Court over a century ago to prevent discrimination by the government on the basis of being in a so-called suspect class. In simpler terms, it protected you from official government discrimination based on the color of your skin, the country you came from, or what religion you were. The last time I checked, owning an AR-15 platform rifle was not on par with being a Christian or having your family's roots in Sweden or Norway. Owning a gun does not make you a member of a particular class. As my colleague, Mr. Roach, said previously, when people see strict, they might think stricter gun laws that will keep us safe. This is a completely false assumption. In fact, the opposite is true. Supporters of this measure want to make guns and the public presence of guns easier, not harder. Real-life examples bear this out. If someday the Iowa State Legislature wants to pass a law, say raising the age of buying firearms to age 21, or ban anyone convicted of domestic violence from purchasing a gun, the evidence to do so must be compelling, not just legitimate. That means we must wait for a school shooting or an epidemic of firearm-related domestic partner violence before any such legislation would stand up in court. Moreover, the final tenet of the strict scrutiny test demands that the legislative objective, and I quote, cannot be achieved through any other means, unquote. So if you want to prevent potential school shootings by establishing zones where only law enforcement can have firearms, that could be easily nullified by the simple proposition that we arm everyone from math teachers to custodians in Iowa public schools. Certainly adding more guns to the atmosphere would deter a would-be shooter. I disagree. The good guy with a gun stops a bad guy with a gun is a myth perpetuated by both the National Rifle Association as well as the gun manufacturing industry. If hundreds of trained police officers in Uvalde, Texas couldn't or wouldn't take down a single shooter armed with a semi-automatic rifle, then I highly doubt that a cafeteria worker pulling a 9mm Glock on someone entering a school is going to make any difference. The problem is that solution is still considered a viable alternative. And that example was precisely what makes strict scrutiny, this part of the measure, so dangerous. Examples like this one would prevent the Iowa State Legislature from enacting future gun safety measures. What we're speaking of here tonight has consequences that may not, well, last not just years, but decades. Iowans will decide a path on election day that will affect their grandchildren and possibly their great-grandchildren. I can honestly say that Iowa will fundamentally change if this measure is codified, and not in a good way. All reliable research bears this out. The number one problem is that both state and local governments will have almost zero ability to enact any sort of common sense gun laws in the future. Small towns all over Iowa will be forced to allow weapons of any types, including the semi-automatic AR-15 platform rifles that have become the new favored weapon of mass shooters, to be carried into places like healthcare facilities, houses of worship, and even places that sell alcohol. You can probably imagine the outcome of an argument between a heavily armed Iowa fan and a similarly armed Iowa State fan at a bar after a few beers too many. And the victims of shootings are not just those directly involved, but innocent bystanders as well. The specter of nullification, the refusal to follow federal law, also looms over the passage of this measure. If the US Congress passes law that bans assault weapons, restricts magazine capacity, demand training and licensing before purchase, and thorough background checks, they could all be prevented or tied up in court before enforcement in the state of Iowa, despite the fact that such a move is a blatant violation of Article 6 of the US Constitution. In effect, what proponents of this measure do is flatly unconstitutional. Laws such as VAWA, or Violence Against Women Act, might not be upheld while the state of Iowa and the US government fight it out in court. In that time, how many women might be victimized by people who should never have access to a weapon in the first place? Another potential life-saving measure, extreme risk or red flag laws, would also be on the chopping block. Under red flag provisions, family members, with the assistance of law enforcement, could apply to the courts to have someone's firearms removed from their possession if there's reason to fear that the person will harm themselves or others. The application of strict scrutiny would make enforcing these laws all near impossible. Even if an individual had accumulated an arsenal, had multiple previous confrontations with police, or posted menacing things online. I have personal experience in how the absence of red flag laws result in tragedy. The Parkland, Florida shooter had the police called to his house for erratic behavior multiple times, but was never investigated fully. Had that been done, he may never had his hands on the weapon that killed my then 14-year-old son's friend and my good friend Fred Gutenberg's daughter. Election day in Iowa in November is perhaps one of the most consequential days in Iowa politics in perhaps decades. The voice of the people has made clear through poll numbers indicating overwhelming support for common sense gun legislation. Don't let a small, well-funded minority set dangerous policy for potential future generations of Iowans. Voting no on Public Measure 1 will move Iowa forward in terms of reduction of gun violence. No one wants to see Davenport High School in 2023 turn into another Parkland, and certainly no one wants another Uvalde. Make Iowa a safer and more welcoming place for families and a state where people want to come to, for business, kids going to college, and folks who just want to start a new life. And all that starts with a resounding vote of no on Public Measure 1 this coming November. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tom, and to our entire panelists. At this time, we want to move to action with time for questions and answers. So during this time, if you have questions, if you would please type your questions in the chat and direct them to me, Nancy Miller. I will take them, and during this time, Laura Anderson, who is with the Franciscan Peace Center, will explain the next steps.
Thank you, Nancy. So by now, I hope that you've been convinced that it is critical to the safety of Iowa residents that you vote no on November 8th on Public Measure Number 1, Iowa's Reckless Gun Amendment. Next slide, please. Here you will see a sneak peek at what your ballot will look like so that you'll know what to expect and you'll know what to look for. The ballot actually will have two sides, and you will find Public Measure 1 on the flip side. So you have to turn your ballot over to see the Public Measure 1. Next slide, please. Public Measure 1 will be the last thing on your ballot on the right side. Down at the bottom, underneath the text that explains the measure, is where you will find the ovals next to the word no that you need to fill in. So please vote no on Public Measure 1 on the back of your ballot. Next page, please. So here are some important dates to keep in mind as you make your plan to vote. I know this is a lot of information here, but again, we are recording the event. So we will be sending you a link to this recording, so you'll have a chance to get all the information in detail later. But to go over it briefly, October 19th is when early voting begins. This is when you vote in person at your county election office during regular business hours. So you could get this out of the way within the next 2 weeks. October 24th is the deadline to request an absentee or vote by mail ballot. So in order to vote by mail in Iowa, you must first submit a written application in order to get a ballot mailed to you. So that application must be received by your county auditor no later than 5 p.m. on the 24th. So you should get that process started as soon as possible if that's what you want to do. This is also the deadline for pre-registration. But if Iowans miss that deadline, you can still register to vote on at your polling place on Election Day. Election Day is November 8th. Polling places throughout your county will be open from 7 a.m. until 8 p.m. Next slide, please. So again, if you do not plan to vote in person, here's what you need to do. You need to visit your county auditor's website and download the application for a mailed absentee ballot. Or you can get one from the website that's listed here, or just do a search for Iowa absentee ballot and you'll find it. Fill out the application, mail it back to your county auditor's office so that it arrives no later than October 24th. Or you can also drop it off in person. Then you wait for your ballot to arrive in the mail. At that point, you will complete your ballot when you receive it and mail it or bring it back to your county auditor right away. The new law says that absentee ballots must be received by your county auditor by 8 p.m. on Election Day in order to be counted. Next slide, please. So here are a few other useful resources. First, we have listed here a website where you can find your local county auditor's office, if you're not already familiar with where that is. And we also have a link here to a website where you can enter your address and find your exact polling place if you do plan to vote in person on November 8th. Next slide, please. So while it is critical that you get out and vote, it's also important that you talk to your friends, your family, your neighbors about this issue and urge them to vote as well. Write letters to the editor, talk about it on Facebook and Twitter. You can follow and share posts from groups like Iowans for Responsible Gun Laws. This is a group of Iowa organizations which have come together to address this specific issue. They've produced the yard signs that you see here, and you can order a yard sign from their website. Also, Iowans for Gun Safety, which has a mission of seeking common sense solutions for gun violence. This is the organization of which Art Roche is the chair. So you can also check out the Iowa chapters of national groups like Moms Demand Action, Every Town for Gun Safety, and March for Our Lives. These are all groups that are working year-round on this important issue. Many of these groups are planning in-person rallies and events locally over the next few weeks. Next slide, please. So just so you know, this is what we're up against. The Iowa Firearms Coalition is a very strong, well-funded pro-gun group here in Iowa. They are calling this the Freedom Amendment. They are supported by companies like Firearms Legal Protection, which is an insurance company that insures gun owners for legal defense fees, and of course, gun manufacturers. They've produced TV commercials, and they also have a yard sign campaign running. And their Facebook page has over 26,000 followers. So there's a lot of people that are passionate about this from the opposing viewpoint. And several state politicians have come out in support of the amendment, including our governor. So please do not sit this one out. Please talk to your neighbors and friends and family, and please vote no on public measure number 1. Thank you. And now back to Nancy,
Sure.
if we have some questions.
Sure, we have some questions, and Any of the panelists can address this question. One of the questions is, why aren't police officers speaking out more about this since it could affect them most directly? And is it prohibited for them to speak out? Any of the panelists go ahead, Art, go ahead.
I can respond just generally that there is an event on October 11th. It's a press conference in which the sheriff and the county attorney from Lynn County are speaking at a press conference by Iowans for Responsible Gun Laws. I think it's 2:30 that day. It'll be on Iowans for Responsible Gun Laws Facebook page, and they will be speaking out against the amendment on our side of this argument. But to the point of the question, you're not going to find a lot of law enforcement officials. First of all, most sheriffs are elected. I guess all sheriffs are elected. Those are elected offices, and elected officials are generally reluctant to speak out on this topic if it's a sensitive issue and deals with with their line of work. Police chiefs are not elected officials, might be more likely to speak out, but we haven't been finding a lot of them willing to do that. So I don't know why. I think if you ask them personally, you would find out from them that they would believe that this constitutional amendment, if passed, would make life worse for them, make their jobs and the jobs of the people that work for them less safe.
Thank you. Any Tom or Dr. Brzezinski, would you like to add to that?
I would echo the fact that when you have people who are elected and will go out of their way, such as sheriffs in Iowa, to avoid offending the electorate and risking re-election. And having known police chiefs from my work on Parkland in private, they worry about the cost of being outgunned by the presence of AR platform rifles on the streets. And they are also worried about the fact that there are now people who actively go online and buy body armor, and makes them harder to take down and puts their officers at risk. But once again, it is a veritable political football to talk about it. And therefore, even though in private, I had one police chief assure me, the fact that, my force is being outgunned and my officers are in danger, they're not going to go before a news reporter and talk about it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Another question is, what are ways that we can keep our schools safe? Tom, you addressed some of that, but if you'd like to speak a little further, and obviously it's one that parents ask, and if you would just address that, please.
Sure, I have no problem with that. The mere presence, the more guns there are, the more gun violence incidents you're going to have. People say, oh, when the most, most violence occurs in gun-free zones is not true. Keeping schools gun-free zones is important. Lowering the amount of, now the favored weapon is the AR-15 platform rifle, okay, which has a muzzle velocity of over 3,000 feet per second and magazine capacity up to 30, allowing, a potential shooter, okay, to do, as much damage as they can in a specific period of time. Banning large capacity magazines for one, limiting them to like 10, okay, getting rid or banning the sale of assault weapon style rifles is definitely another, because the last time I checked, nobody went into a school and murdered 15 to 20 children in under a minute with a knife or a hatchet. Okay. In one sentence, it's the guns. The less guns there are, the safer people are going to be.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Another question is, if this passes, is there any chance that it could ever be revoked?
Well, I'll try. From a constitutional perspective, if we did this we did this basically with prohibition at the national level. We tried prohibition, it didn't work, and we repealed it. Okay. But if this amendment passes, I look at the amount of time that passed between the enacting of prohibition before it was repealed during the Roosevelt administration. Okay. This situation, it could take a similar period of time to get even an amendment on the ballot. And plus, as Art mentioned, it has to go through the legislature first. And if you've got a Republican-controlled legislature that has already put it on the books, unless it is controlled by the opposite party, or all of a sudden the Republican Party has a change of heart, okay, it's going to be nearly impossible to have that amendment repealed.
I'd like to add that
Okay, sure, Art, go ahead.
the flip side of that question is if this is passed, if the yes vote prevails, will it be possible to revoke it at some point in the future? And for all the same reasons that Tom Brzezinski just stated, it would be a very arduous task. I guess it's legally possible, but either way, it's difficult. I want to also remind listeners and people watching this that I kind of glossed over the way this came into legislation. There was another period of 4 previous years before all the legislation that I mentioned, where this almost got put on the ballot 4 years, or I guess 5 years earlier, because two consecutive sessions of Iowa legislature passed it, and then by some fluky situation, perhaps the Secretary of State didn't get it to the governor for signature in time, something like that. That whole process got negated, and then they had to start over again. They started over with two more consecutive sessions. So I guess that just points out the dogged determination of the opposition. So if they fail this time, they could come back again, and we need to be ever vigilant.
Okay, a couple others. This is to anyone. Do you know who was the original drafter of this amendment? I hear of certain national conservative think tanks that draft model ordinance for passage by conservative legislators. Did that happen here in Iowa? Is that where the strict scrutiny language originated? I guess they're really asking to know who was the original writer of that.
Well, it's hard to say. A lot of legislation in Iowa does get brought to us from national groups, and people pick up on it, and the language is shared by different states. So in this particular case, I'm not sure exactly where it came from, but it's very similar to the language as we saw in a couple other states. And so legislators among states talk with each other. So I don't doubt that there was some national work being done on that.
Okay, thank you. Oh, go ahead, Art.
Just kind of in that same vein,
Sure.
I'd like to point out that there have been no situations where this has been gotten to the point where Iowa's amendment is where it's being voted on by the populace, and that it has failed. So we will be the first state where that has happened, and proudly so. But that hasn't been the case anywhere in the other 3 states that have tried it. No other state has tried it, and we're not aware of any other state that's mounting a campaign like this. So we are also kind of a role model. People are watching us in other states to see whether this is going to be the trend or whether we're going to buck the trend.
Okay, a couple of questions. I heard you say that existing laws would be subject to being attacked in Iowa. What current law in Iowa might be in jeopardy if this amendment passes? We have a couple other questions, so if you could just restate your early response to that.
You were addressing that to me?
Anybody who wants to answer it?
I think one of the Toms might answer that better.
Very little, because the legislature has really done a lot in terms of already putting some measures that the gun people want to have into place. I mean, stand your ground is here, so-called constitutional carry is here. There's really very few things that would be in jeopardy, in my opinion, with this amendment. It's more about what we might want to have flexibility to do in the future. But it wouldn't be surprising. Nothing comes to mind, but it wouldn't be surprising if there was some court action if this does go into the Constitution for some other things that might be out there.
I just want to add to that, that the biggest problem of this is sympathetic law enforcement, which does exist, might choose not to enforce federal gun laws that may be passed that may make Iowa safer. And because they can say, well, the state constitution of Iowa says that I can't do this, therefore I'm not going to go seize this person's weapons, no matter how what they posted online or what they've done, etc. And then everything gets tied up in court. And when things get tied up in the courts, we all know they take a considerable amount of time to unwind. And my concern is, like, how many people are going to be harmed, in that time if, say, we do pass a semi-automatic rifle ban at the national level, and all of a sudden in Iowa it's challenged, in court, and people are going to rush out and try to buy these weapons, in droves, and have access to them while it's being decided.
Thank you. One or two other questions. If this vote passes, would it allow the state government to take guns away from law-abiding citizens?
I can answer that. Absolutely not. What people don't realize is the fact that there are more guns in this country than there are people. It is physically impossible for, even if we mobilize our entire armed forces, every police officer in Iowa, okay, the National Guard, and try to take weapons away, from quote unquote, law-abiding gun-owning citizens. Okay, so that is simple. That is a simple boogeyman invented by the opposition, okay, or actually the proponents of amendments like this, to say, oh, if any reasonable gun measure is passed, your guns are going to be taken away, and nothing could be further from the truth, because it is physically impossible, and moreover, it's unconstitutional under the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution.
Art, would you say something there?
I just wanted to add that as the question was stated, it was if this is passed, would people be able to have their guns taken away? And of course, that would be just the opposite of the intent of the proponents of this amendment. So, that's even more unlikely. I think probably the questioner was wondering if our position was upheld and it was not passed, would that be possible? And then everything Tom Brzezinski just said is absolutely true.
Yes, the only reason that you would have your guns confiscated, it was be under a red flag law if you posed a direct threat, to yourself or others. And Art, in his presentation, mentioned, the suicide rate by firearm. And if a family member has the ability to contact law enforcement and get a court order to have that person's firearms confiscated, we could save a lot of lives.
That possibility is at risk because of if this constitutional amendment is passed, that red flag law possibility is it becomes, yes.
Okay, one more question here is, and I'll just pose it. Will Catholic parishes in Iowa be speaking about this matter from the pulpit? In bulletins, the priests need to educate their congregations and be vocal.
Yeah, I can jump in on that. Just so you know, we do have a flyer that we do every 2 years that's called Faithful Citizenship. It's available on our website. It's also been sent to every parish for distribution through the parishes. It's also being sent by the bishops to the parishes for distribution. And there is a piece on there that includes a discussion about this amendment. So that is something that's going to be out there, I believe, in addition to some questions that people should be asking candidates. Now, whether that actually translates to priests talking about it in the pulpit, I would say the honest answer is some will, a lot won't. Many pastors are scared to talk about anything political in the first place. But certainly they've got the tools that they need to speak about it if they would like to do that.
Okay, I'm looking at that. We're close to time here. I certainly want to thank all of our participants for the questions that you raised to our panelists. And now I will turn it back to Laura.
Thank you, Sister Nancy, and thank you very much to all of our panelists and everyone in our audience for joining us. On behalf of the women religious congregations, the Sisters of St. Francis, Clinton, Iowa, the Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the Sisters of St. Francis, Dubuque, Iowa, the Discalced Carmelite Nuns, the Congregation of the Humility of Mary, Sisters of the Presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Sisters of Mercy of the Americas Justice Team, Dominican Sisters of Sinsinawa, and Divine Word College. A special thank you to Logan Riley for handling technology for tonight's program, and Jennifer Krizik as well. If you'd like more information about upcoming events and action alerts, you can email myself at center@clintonfranciscans.com or Sister Nancy Miller at justice@bbmsisters.org. Again, the Iowans for Responsible Gun Laws.com is the organization within Iowa of folks who have joined together specifically to fight this, this public measure number 1. For those who have registered for the Zoom webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with information about how to access a recording of this webinar. Once again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Please get registered to vote, talk to your friends and neighbors, and vote no on Public Measure 1, the Reckless Gun Amendment. Thank you.